Thank you, Professor. I'm glad to be here. My name is Claiton da Silva. I am from Brazil. Today I work at the Universidade Federal de da Fronteira Sul in Chapecó. And today I would like to, before to start my talk, I would like to say thank you for Rachel Carson Center, the institution. Say thank you for the Rachel Carson Center colleagues, fellows, and all the community here. I'd like to say thank you for the Rockefeller Archive Center who helped me to support some research some years ago, and my fellows and some colleagues who are inspiration for my work in Brazil, like Lise Cedrés, Sandro Dutra, Joc Lanovics, and also Marina Andreoli, who is here today. I will talk about a change in society's perception of soil fertility is one of the most important events that led to the transformation of the Brazilian Cerrados. Until 1960s, Cerrados, the Brazilian Cerrados were considered as a barren land, a desert. Because of its acid soils. But since then, since 1960s, 1970s, supporters of the industrial agribusiness, they argue that a miracle happened at the Cerrado. And the arguments about the increase of agricultural production, according to Norman Borlaug, the father of Green Revolution and Nobel Prize, is one of the greatest achievements for mankind. And it was a good weapon to fight against starvation. So we have two different ideas here I will discuss with you. The idea of a miracle and the idea of deforestation and environmental problems. The first part of my talk, I'll introduce you some aspects of the Cerrado in general. Then I will talk about the agricultural experiments who driven the transformation of the Cerrado. And then I'll talk about the consequences. First of all, the Cerrado soils, in special savannas and fields, challenged different agricultural groups for centuries. For each experiment invited new challenges. A turning point, however, took place in 1958 in an agricultural experiment conducted by US soil scientists that changed the interpretation of Brazilian scholars, business persons, politicians and progressive farmers. Not only about the savannas soil, but also about Cerrado biome in general. Early experiments focused on field areas characterized by sparse small trees, bushes, and grasses. At that time, farmers usually appreciate soils under forests for their higher fertility. For the first time, agronomists consider savannas and fields as a suitable place for large-scale agriculture using NPK fertilization, lime, and micronutrients. So, change in the perception about soils led to changes in the perception about economic integration of the whole environment into national and international scale. This is the origin of agricultural frontier advancement in Brazilian Cerrados. Okay. Cerrado is a Iberian word both for Portuguese and Spanish. And the meaning is closed, dense fields, inhospitable. Cerrado is the Brazilian part of the interplanetary family of the savannas, and it covers more than 2 million squares, about 23% of the Brazilian territory, a small place, very small place, equivalent to the combined area of Spain, France, Italy, and Britain. Just 175 million hectares in a contiguous block. Okay. Here in yellow we have the Cerrado area. We have some enclaves in Amazonia. It reaches the equator until subtropical Brazil, reaching parts in Paraguay and Bolivia. It's surrounded by Amazonia, the Caatinga, Atlantic Forest, and please keep in mind, for those who are not familiar with the Brazilian map, that São Paulo is not in the Cerrado area, but we'll know about it later. I'll talk about it. Okay, these are some characteristics of the Cerrados, savannas in general, and the shrub fields. We call it in Portuguese campos sujos. Both were these savannas and fields were not appreciated by farmers until at least 1950s, early 1960s. Cerrado is the largest hotspot in Southern Hemisphere and second largest biome today. So that's the importance to study about the Cerrado. With about 5% of total world fauna and more than these numbers in terms of plant species. And it's a very controversial place because you can have in the same biome high modern cities like Brasilia and places, rural areas similar to the common areas where people, traditional peoples need to gather fruit, seeds to survive. About 33 million inhabitants live in urban areas, and 12.5 million people depend on agriculture, natural ecosystems, and humid zones. The main problems of the Cerrado today, the first one is cattle, the livestock. We have more cattle than inhabitants in Brazil. Only in the Cerrado in 2013, Brazil had about 72 million heads. It's a great, huge impact. Another problem, you probably heard about it, is the soybean cultivation, as well as maize and cotton. In 1970, this yellow area was the area for cultivating soy. But in 2003, it expanded a lot as part of the Republic of Soybean in Latin America. Here is a picture I consider very interesting because the landscape, here you can see the livestock and the soybean production. According to traditional cultivation in Brazil, these areas probably will be for cattle in 2 or 3 or 4 years because the Brazilian farmers, some of them, perhaps most of them, they prefer to advance agricultural frontier instead to recover the soils. And some problems. We have the sugarcane plantations as biofuels, forestry, eucalyptus, and fire. And some environmental disasters we can see right now in Brazil. One of them are soil erosion, forest burnings, some invasive species like pangola and gordura grass, swine breeding reaching 6,000 square year of deforestation per year. It's decreasing. It was higher some years ago. So to finish the first part, I would like to show that at least 30% of the Cerrados are today part of planted pasture. It means that 60 million hectares of land. It's not a small place. About 20% of annual and perennial crops, just a small part for forestry, urban areas and other activities, and according to this graphic, 55% of the Cerrado has native vegetation, but some scholars are supporting that it reached at least 67% of deep high modification. So the focus of my book is about how did the Cerrado become an agricultural miracle. In 1970, for example, we had just 4.5% of agricultural land use for agriculture in the Cerrado region. In 2010, it reached at least 42% for cattle and agriculture. Well, the pattern of land occupation in central Brazil focused on livestock since 19th century and clearing forests for small-scale agriculture. The field and savanna soils were considered as marginal area for agriculture until the 1960s and abandoned for a long period. Land use included only subsistence agriculture along the rivers and some beef cattle grazing on native pastures. In the early 1960s, the livestock society and all different social groups living into the Brazilian Cerrados developed any kind of technique or technology to deal with Brazilian brave central west. Cattle advanced since 19th century shaped towns, roads and villages. High and dry temperatures during local summer and storms during the winter did not avoid the advancement of pioneer settlements. Wild animals were systematically hunted. Violent politics of negotiation, control or extermination of indigenous people provided free areas to the advance of cattle and the agricultural adaptation of the fertile areas. However, a big challenge remained for Brazilian elites when the construction of the new capital Brasilia started in 1950s. With increasing deficit of food production and the reduction of the fertile areas in eastern Brazil, how to convert millions of acid soils of campo and savannas square in the heart of country into agricultural lands? It was imperative. The eastern Atlantic forest was devastated and its soils also unfertile. As Brazilian historian Sandro Dutra pointed out, the concept of West replaced the idea of an inhospitable wilderness during the first part of the 20th century. The integration of Western lands was part of an ideological project of territorial integration aiming to provide a sense of national meaning for different social groups. The idea of prosperity was a motivation for the advancement of national projects. However, after World War II, the ideological use of concepts like West and frontier were reshaped, embracing the geopolitics of early Cold War era and the Green Revolution, inserting the idea of development in the socio-political agenda, and later the idea of modernization in the 1970s. It would be necessary not only to experiment fertilizers, seeds, pesticides or irrigation techniques to face the challenges of Cerrado soils. It would be necessary to create a complex of different institutions to develop it. Since then, the concept of agricultural frontier embraced elements of Cold War, Green Revolution, merging authoritarian projects of high modernism with traditional slash-and-burn agricultural techniques. I consider, as I told in the beginning of my talk, the work of Nelson Rockefeller's IRI Research Institute the turning point for these transformations. First of all, in São Paulo, in the state of São Paulo, after 80 years of cultivation of coffee lands, the farmers didn't replace the fertilization in the soils. So this international institute, founded in 1950, was looking for projects to recover the soil fertility in coffee lands, because coffee is was the commodity, Brazilian commodity at all at that moment, and still part of the exportations of Brazil. They found some typical exhausted coffee lands, and they tried to make agricultural experiments in fertilization. After 5 years, they realized that the Brazilian farmers were not interested in this kind of fertilization projects because it was cheaper to advance the agricultural frontier in a way that one of the agronomists called cut, burn, destroy, and move on agriculture. That's the word. But after some years of experience, one of these agronomists from United States called Andrew Colin McClung, he realized that the soils of the depleted coffee lands in Brazil were very similar to soils not too far from that farm, Cambuí farm in the state of São Paulo, that are Cerrado campos, Cerrado fields. So they started to experiment first the old NPK fertilization and try to combine macro and micro elements to try to discover something. And for example, one of the first experiments was based on NPK plus sulfur. They also create some greenhouses for pot culture in soil fertility. So it was brand new for Brazilians at that moment to create a greenhouse and to study the pot culture. After the greenhouse, they used to adapt some of the plant introducing to the gardenings and try to check if it was working or not on Cerrado soils. And here we have the first great experiment they had. It's the no fertilizer minus phosphorus and the complete fertilization in a campo soil, Cerrado soil, it's the field, the word field for campo. Soil showing response to phosphorus, and the Pangola grass, African grass introduced decades ago in Brazil, is used as plant indicator. So in 1958 they published an article, and some agronomists in Brazil who were trying to develop some experiments there were very impressed about this article because in his final words, McClung wrote that these experimentations could increase up to 300% the yields of soybean, cotton, and maize in the Cerrado soil. So Brazilians went crazy about it. And again, it was imperative because Brasilia, the new capital of Brazil, is in the heart of the Cerrado. So it was necessary to have food supply not only for the capital but for the region. It was their arguments. So trying to start to sum up the idea, we have Brazilians, elites, intellectuals, farmers, politicians, ranchers, looking for development projects, and to increase agriculture and livestock production. At the same time, Brazilian farmers, especially the southern farmers, were looking for cheaper lands to cultivate. At that moment, the Cold War during the Cold War, Brazil and United States had an agreement of technical cooperation under the Point 4. Some years later, in 1964, the Brazilian had started a military dictatorship, and it has a great influence over this process. And of course, the mentioned Green Revolution and the IRI Research Institute research. Okay, so after 1960, Brasilia was inaugurated. In 1973, during the military dictatorship, the Brazilian government created a new institution called Embrapa, the Brazilian Agricultural Research Corporation, to work with different cultures, cultivation and biomes in Brazil. And one specific is for Cerrado, the Embrapa Cerrados. In 1970s, the southern farmers were looking for cheaper lands in Brazil. They had some experience to cultivate in dry and acid lands in the Pampas, in Brazilian Pampas, and they brought some experience, and the government was, according to the government, it was a great formula to bring southern Brazilians, farmers, research corporations as Embrapa, and fertilization techniques to increase the agricultural production. After years, this is the final part of my talk, the yields increased a lot in Brazil. And the way that Brazilians were dealing with the Cerrado, reshaping the landscape, introducing new seeds, fertilizers, new techniques, today is well recognized as the Cerrado agricultural model. It's a model based on commodities, pesticides, irrigation, the agribusiness. For example, in Brazil, 70% of the water used in Brazil is by agribusiness. Agricultural fertilization and replace agricultural annual cultures by livestock with a high investment of foreign capital and governmental and private institutions. Some people often say that the Cerrado model is also sustainable. Yes, according to some agronomists or soil scientists, Embrapa developed, for example, some family-type farm projects and sustainability practice, but in a small scale. There was still a gap between science and farming in Brazil, because Brazil has technology enough to increase food production without accelerating deforestation, but Brazilians don't do it. They prefer to keep on going, to keep the advancement of agricultural frontier. However, deforestation, greenhouse gas emissions, murdering of environmental leaders, small farmers, and landless peasants are part of the story. Just to finish my talk, I'm talking about soils, but I'm also talking about power. I'd like to finish my talk with the John McNeil and Vinnie Varter coding that everywhere long-term economic trajectories, the ebb and flow of political power, the waxing and waning of populations rested on successful management of soil nutrients. For want of nitrogen, many a kingdom was lost. That's all, folks. Thank you.